Thanks, John. Today's episode is brought to you by Standout Nutrition, where they pride themselves in creating some of the most delicious and healthy smoothies and teas. Whether it's a post-workout protein-rich smoothie, a healthy breakfast, lunch, or anytime snack, they have what you need. Mention Model Mindset for $1 off. Welcome back, everybody, to Model Mindset. I hope you are having a fantastic week. Today's guest is Kate Mollison, who is the founder of On Tuesdays We Wear Black, which is dedicated to supporting organizations and employers in addressing one of life's most challenging and often overlooked experiences, grief. Kate, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, guys, for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
So let's dive in and kick it off. What inspired you to start your company On Tuesdays We Wear Black?
Well, it's a long and short story, right? So I'll give you the Spark Notes version for all of the people out there who are old like me and remember Spark Notes.
Say Spark Notes. I love it.
Spark Notes, that's a deep cut. So about 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, I was unexpectedly widowed. And when that happened, I had 2 small kids. I had 2 adult disabled parents. I had a home that my name was not on in any capacity due to, financial situation. I couldn't be a part of the mortgage. So we made a decision. I took care of the cars. He took care of the house. There were so many things that happened right after his death that were just trauma after trauma after trauma. And within 90 days, I found myself a squatter in my own home with a 60% hit to my income, at risk of losing my corporate job that I'd been with for years, that I went to school for, that I'd been, headhunted for, having children who are now at the precipice of having to not potentially have Christmas because of the timing. It was this cacophony of experiences that shouldn't have happened, all piled on top of one another. And I got to the end of that first, 18 months. And I finally felt like I was able to take the real first deep breath after Craig died. And I looked back at the path behind me, right? And it was mayhem. And I went, wow, that was like being waterboarded with gasoline. There is no way that anybody should have to do that alone again at all. And I looked back and I said, okay, I'm going back. And I started walking in reverse, and I started going back, walking the path that I had walked, picking up the pieces, trying to figure out how I survived, how I got to the end. And on that process, it unearthed in me where I was like, there's work to be done. And so many steps there in between, but now the abridged version is November of 2022, the 2-year anniversary of my husband's passing. I launched On Tuesdays We Wear Black. It is a business that, like you said, helps support employers, but it's so much more than that. It is a company that helps break down barriers and create communication channels and solve problems and protect retention and protect employees and protect culture, company culture. It is about your rudimentary philosophy in how you operate as a business owner. And I didn't realize that when I started the business, but it's kind of dawned on me that it's this thing that's so much bigger than me and wouldn't be possible without the gift of perspective, as I like to call it. Craig's passing is really a gift of perspective.
Yeah. And now having juggled all that and having started this company and exploring all of these things, did you find that you feel people have a misunderstanding of what grief truly is, like in its totality?
Oh, for sure. I love this question. And it's something that I work really hard to re-educate people on, right? We as a society are not taught how to handle loss, how to handle death, how to talk about uncomfortable things. But what we are given is inaccurate language, right? The word bereavement and grief and death and mourning and sympathy, and all of these words get murky because they get interchanged. But the fact of the matter is they're actually different things. Grief is the emotional and chemical response that you experience within your body. It's a physiological journey. But like bereavement, that's the legal time off that you get from work to handle paperwork. Sympathy, that's an emotion that you feel when you cannot actually relate to someone. Empathy, that's a feeling that you can use and support when you can translate your own experiences to someone else's hurt. So we have to re-educate the culture around us on what those words actually mean and then what to do with them.
Wow.
Yeah.
And when you were looking back on your journey and navigating all of that, was that almost like, oh my God, I can't believe I did all that? And then almost did it make you say, well, if I struggle with that, I feel like I could support others too as well? Is that like kind of where you're like, oh my God, this is kind of what I'm called here to do?
Yeah, I remember the moment it kind of like washed over me very, very clearly. And so early on after Craig's death, one of the things I found really helpful was to go visit the spot where we got married. So it's a local park. It's called Sunrise Park in Suffield. We lived in the town at the time, so it was free to town residents. Craig picked it out. It was right on the water, mountain in the background. It was gorgeous, right? So that was the place, like more than the cemetery, more than anything else, and all of the upheaval, that was the place I felt closest to him. And I went there and I remember reflecting back on that journey and on that path. And I could hear him in the back of my mind, right? Clear as day, probably the first time I really heard his voice after his passing. And it was that if I could just help one person not experience what I experienced, then his death wasn't in vain because his death was medical negligence. His death was avoidable, preventable on so many levels, at so many points of intervention. And beyond that, his death was careless, right? Like how it happened, how we got there, the actual execution of it, if you will, pardon the pun. But we got there and it was all so senseless. And so if I can take everything that I learned, that trial by fire, and help someone else put it into practical application, then my time wasn't wasted and his life wasn't lost for nothing.
That's incredible.
And how long did it take you to get to that point, Kate? Like how long, because people may hear that and go, "Oh my God, like she's so strong, she's so amazing." And not that that's not true, but how long did that process take for you? I mean, it seems like a quick turnaround when you say it, but I'm sure it wasn't.
Well, and the transparent thing that, people have to understand is that grief isn't something that we get over. Grief isn't something that we accomplish or that we finish or it's not that good book on the beach that we finally can slap the cover on and put down and walk away from and go, wow, that was a lot. Grief is a part of you. It becomes part of your chemistry. Intrinsically, you are altered. Your very fabric is altered because grief simply is just the leftover love that you have to give this person that does not exist anymore.
Mhm.
So that's how you're just continuing that relationship, right? So
Yeah.
grief doesn't go away. So for people to say, wow, you're doing so well. No, I just have space from it and I've had practice riding the dragon, if you will. Like
Mm,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah.
you get used to being in a cortisol high, you get used to being in a body dysregulation, you get used to being in fight or flight. And all of those things are dependent on your childhood, your current surrounding, your mental health, your physical fortitude. All of those things are interdependent. But for someone like me who comes from a life of trauma, maybe I'm a little bit more predisposed for that resiliency.
Mm.
For the people who don't have the gift of poverty like I do, maybe I try to put a gratitude spin on things, like I
Yeah.
am who I
Right.
am because of what I've been through. And if I were negative about it, then I wouldn't be who I am, I guess. I don't know.
Right. No, I hear
But to
that.
answer
Yeah.
your question, it's I still have bad days. I still
Yeah.
have really bad days. I still have, November every year sucks. It is just a month where I want to crawl in a hole and pull it in after me and not talk to anybody. But that's like
Mm,
the month where you can't do that because it's the start
mm,
of holiday and family. And, Craig, that
mhm,
rat
mhm.
bastard, for forcing me to be social for the rest of my life. Thank you so much. He's like, ha ha, watch this, is what he
Yeah,
said.
right?
But it was a short turnaround, yes. But I also pride myself in my ability to be self-reflective. I've always
Mm,
been someone who's pulled myself up by my bootstraps because I've had to, right? Everyone's like, "Oh my God, you're so strong. How'd you do it?" I'm like, I had a 19-month-old and an 11-month-old. If it weren't for them, full transparency, I'd probably be a prostitute under a bridge in Hartford because I was
it's
just in the bottom of a
yeah.
brown liquor bottle, feeling my feelings, lost the love of my life. Like
Yeah.
that
Mhm,
person, right? And if you don't know what that feels like, it's your childhood dog that you had to put down. It's your best friend from
mhm,
college who got a job at the other side of the country. It's your parents selling your childhood home. It's putting a hole in your favorite sweater. If that is literally your only experience with loss that feels that sentimental weight to you, then it's that, right? So
mhm.
I lost that one thing. So of course it's hard. It's still hard. But I have to show my kids every day that literally that does not kill you, makes you stronger.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that experience too that, you can teach them as well to bounce back as well, but also keep those fond memories as well, keep them going.
For sure.
Mhm.
And, you touched on it, but I'd really like to understand, how does grief affect our emotional and our physical well-being? Do you know any kind of like science that is
Mm.
is the latest science on that?
Yeah, so this is my bread and butter. I love to tell people about this stuff because the unawareness that we have, the lack of awareness of how deeply affected we are by our emotions is mind-boggling to me. So when you have an extremely stressful event, i.e., death, right, of a close loved one, your brain starts to produce the stress hormone cortisol. It takes about 6 weeks for that cortisol to reach a peak production because you are just constantly pumping it out. You don't have the counter hormone, the serotonin, to slow the production and help keep you in a regulated cycle. So, what happens when you have too much cortisol? You start either overeating, like binge eating because you're emotionally eating, or you undereat. You skip meals, you become like manic almost. You can have headaches, migraines, physical body aches, vision impairment, hearing impairment, joint pain, joint swelling. It can open you up for a predisposition of bone marrow disease, immunality diseases, other cellular degenerative diseases, and it's even linked to juvenile diabetes.
Jeez.
So, and that's like obviously big scale stuff, right? But if we
Right.
have
Mm,
this repetitive, constant, high production of stress hormone in our body, the rest of our body systems start to shut down. So, our endocrine system becomes flooded and then it can't communicate appropriately with our pituitary gland. Our pituitary gland backs up, and then we lose that sleep cycle. We don't get our REM, we don't have our white blood cells healing. So, it actually has this cyclical degenerative effect if it goes untreated.
wow.
And all of those things just keep like feeding into each other, right? Like you sleep like shit because you ate like shit because you drank too much because you're feeling
Mhm.
your feelings, and then you oversleep, and then you eat like shit, and then you feel like
Yeah.
shit, and you just
Yep.
keep going down the toilet quite literally
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, I
until
mean, you were
someone shakes you out of it. That's the OODA
Right.
loop you're going to live in.
and you were talking about it before. You had a 19-month-old and 11-month-old at that time. So, were you experiencing any of those symptoms, if you will?
It's so wild to be on this side of it, right? To like be conscious and cognizant and have done the research and have the training and the certifications that I do now because I understand it from a textbook logical situation. But I also have the lived experience, right? And while there's lots of times that I'm like, yes, 100%, there's so many times where I go, you know what? I couldn't tell you. I was
Mhm.
so dissociated. I was so numb. I was so distracted. So much of my grief got initially put on the back burner because of the bereavement stuff I had to do, right? Like taking care of putting a roof over my kids' heads, making sure because we had been served with squatter papers. So, or like foreclosure papers. So it's like I was squatting in my own home. How do I find a house? How do I navigate more money? So I was putting out fires.
Mm.
Yeah.
So really, what was I doing? What was I feeling? It was that again, that there's no stopping. There's no choice to not move forward because I
Mm,
have things and people dependent on me. And you just kind of go
yeah.
into autopilot.
Right. And you had mentioned before a lot of the things and misconceptions, if you will, right? You mentioned bereavement there. You mentioned about how you had that company job that you worked so hard for and were headhunted for and all that, right? And in our conversations that we had, this was maybe a month and a half ago that the three of us had, you were explaining a lot of that to us about what your role is now and how you teach and educate those employers and those places of business how to properly handle these situations, right? So what do you feel like, and what have you seen in your profession thus far that you are noticing as some misconceptions inside of the business world when it comes to grief?
Yeah, I love that question. So there's a lot of disconnect between what businesses say and what businesses do, right? We all know what a company culture is supposed to be, what those core values, all of those pillars of behavioral whatever that people put out there, right? That mission statement and purpose. But we all have worked the average Joe job and know that it's all smoke and mirrors. It's cute, like, oh, well, I'm here if you need anything. Let me know if you need
Mhm.
anything. That door, oh, my door's always open. Yeah, your door's always open if I'm coming to tell you, hey, I'm available to work more hours, or hey, like I'm going on leave, but
Yeah.
it's not here like, hey, there's been a death, I need to leave. So
Right.
the biggest misconception for employers, first and foremost, is your HR department is not your legal department. The H in HR stands for human, and you are meant to be the liaison between the employee and the employer. Human resources is that person. Now, no, it's not your job to therapize the employee, right? Like you're not their therapist, but you are the coordinator, the case manager, the gatekeeper of employee assistance programs, therapy referrals, local businesses that offer support, any other partnerships or referral connections that the company may have. That's your job as HR, is to get that information in front of the person who's struggling as easily as possible. You hand them a pamphlet with a 1-800 number and they have to sit on hold for 4 hours, they're going to give up and jump off the bridge. I hate to say it.
Yeah.
Let's not beat
Yep.
around the bush. It takes so much for someone in that high cortisol hormone time to actually have the fortitude and the cognition to come forward and say, I need help. And then when they do that, it's met with just work harder. You know, literally something my boss said to me: when my cat died, I found it helpful to throw myself into my work. You'll probably find the same, she says to me 48 hours after his death.
Unbelievable.
And then she followed it up saying, well, the cat was 16 and had cancer, so not quite the same thing.
That's
She looked me
insensitive.
dead in the face on a Zoom call and said this to me.
Oh my
Right? So, how
gosh.
employers in good conscience can think that they're helping. So, rule number two, that's my segue. Rule number two: if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. We all
Mm.
remember the kids' movie Bambi, Thumper's golden
Yeah.
rule. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. And if you're unsure of what to say that.
Mm.
I have no words.
Right.
I hurt for you. I see this is difficult. Something simple, right? Like, don't overcomplicate it. We all try to reinvent the wheel and come up with the most sincere, most condoled. No, like, just there's nothing you can say that fixes it. It sucks. We know it sucks, and you're making it worse by open mouth insert foot. So
Yeah.
just shut the hell up. If
Yeah.
your sentence starts with at least, you should be throat punched. That's my
rule
professional opinion.
rule of thumb.
So,
Yeah.
so that's rule number two for employers: is one, know the roles and responsibilities, know who your team of people are to help you. And if you don't have an HR department, then it's your responsibility to know what those resources are. And that's where I come in. You can hire me to be that person for you. Most small businesses don't have the capacity to afford HR departments or employee assistance programs, and that's kind of what I do. Is I come in and I bridge that gap. Don't say stupid things. Sounds
Yeah.
pretty straightforward, right? And don't fall into the pitfalls of unlimited time off. I hear that a lot lately. Like companies like, oh, well, my company, we just kind of have an open policy. I can take as much time as I need. I'm like, right. But then statistically speaking, when people have that, they don't take any time.
I've seen
And you
that as
actually have
well.
to mandate them taking vacations because they just default bank their time. So that doesn't solve the problem either. It's not
Yeah.
about how much time. Yes, it is about how much time, but it's not overall about how much time, but it's about the understanding of why we need the time, how much time we realistically need, and how you get that person to come back when the time is up, because that's ultimately what everybody wants. And that's the other part that I help with, is that re-entry transition. How do you understand that grief is a living, breathing document, right? Like, it is constantly evolving. You hit that 6-week peak, but then you have to come back down. And sometimes that's not a linear path. It's a little
Mhm.
jagged, because you're going to have a really great stretch of time, and then you're going to have a trigger, and then you're going to, fall off, or you're going to get sick and your immune system's lower, and then you're going to feel a grief episode. You're going to go to work and you're going to get exhausted because you have fatigue and brain fog. Grief mimics the signs of early Alzheimer's. So you
Wow.
go to do your job and you can't remember that contact you're trying to send an email to. But then you start to get performance managed and critiqued. And then your social perception starts to change. And then you're ostracized at work. And then you're not selected for special projects or promotions. And then you get depressed. And then you withdraw. And then you start drinking. And then you become a closeted alcoholic. And again, we're making a big jump. But there's a trajectory, right? Where your whole life falls apart because of how you're supported when you come back to work. So I help employers have that intermittent leave policy set up, where if they come back and then they need to take a day, it doesn't hurt the business or interrupt the business. I help the employer get key benefit policies. So employee policies that cover the business if there's a loss in wages for a key employee. You can't replace that employee, but you can have an insurance policy that helps cover what their wages would have been if they're out. That's huge for small businesses. I
Yeah.
also help do training and development. So how do you talk to that person? That person comes back into the office. Nobody knows what to say. How long do you wait? How awkward is it? Do you invite them to things? We do some icebreakers. We do some reconnections. We do some company culture building so everyone feels like a family.
Mhm.
We spend so much time with the people that we work with, right? Statistically speaking, I think Americans spend about 76 hours per week with their work family,
Wow.
in comparison to 33 and a third hours with their home family.
It's wild. It's
Like,
wild.
we see these
Yeah.
people more than we see our own kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't we treat them the same?
Yeah. Exactly.
It's
Because it
so
costs
true.
nothing to be nice.
You're right. You touched on something there that like instantly brought me back. And John, I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but
Go ahead.
I remember when John's father had passed back in
Mm.
2017. I just didn't know what to say, and like part of me felt incredibly guilty because you don't want to say, "Oh, hey, how about them Yankees?" You
Yeah.
don't. It's like surface level conversation,
Lovely weather we're having.
right?
Yeah.
And it's like I just didn't know what to say.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you bringing that up. And
Here's
like
the real
John,
kicker for people listening, and I don't mean to interrupt
Yeah.
you, but I just want to throw this out there. Just ask, right?
Yeah.
Like, I would have much rather people say to me, do you need advice or do you just need support?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Just ask the question, because so much of grief is out of your hands. So much
Mm.
of loss, and specific to spouse loss, but in so many facets of it, grief is out of your hands. It is happening to you. So by someone just putting choice back in my hands, by someone making it a question and involving me in the decision-making process, game changer. Just ask them. Say, I don't know what to say right now.
Mhm.
Do you want to just be silent?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And that's a
Do
big
you want
thing.
me to
So
just sit here with you, or do you need to be alone?
that's it. That's a big thing I think people misunderstand too, is the power of presence. Like
Yeah.
in those moments where you don't know what to say, oftentimes that person doesn't maybe want you to say anything, but wants your presence. So when the time comes, maybe you feel like you're ready to say something, they're there. Or they just feel that support. They know
Yeah.
you're there. And I remember having a conversation with my sister-in-law when my brother-in-law was losing his father recently. And she's like, I don't know what to do. I don't know, like, I don't know what to say to him. I don't know. Like, I feel like we've had all the conversations we can, but like, what do I say? And I'm like, he doesn't want you probably to say anything at this point. He wants you to sit down next to him on the bed, sit down next to him on the couch, and just be next to him. Put your hand on his lap, hold his hand and just be with him. And that's the power of presence is so undervalued sometimes, man, because we feel like as a society we have to just keep blurting things out until something works or something hits.
Yeah.
But it's just like,
The
man,
power
just
of
be
presence
present. Be
and the
present.
power of question. I think
Yeah.
question is just as important in presence, because I know with me, people wanted to like hug on me and I physically could not be touched. It was such a visceral reaction for me, where
Yeah.
even my own mother went to touch me and it, like, made my skin crawl. So people
Mhm.
just understanding, like, I need you in the room with me. I need that body doubling, but please don't touch me. Like,
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
it's gonna end bad for people. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
yeah, the
And
questions though, like, so much of it is happening to you. Ask the questions. Like, do you
Mhm.
want me to stay? Do you want to be alone? Can I bring
Right.
you a snack? Have you eaten today?
Mhm.
Like, hey, would you like to go for a walk? I'm going. We don't have to talk.
Right.
Send me your list. I'm going to the grocery store. I'd love to just pick up the few things that you need. I'll drop them on your porch. Hey,
yeah.
can I pick up the kids from school today and take them to the playground for an hour so you can take a nap? I'd love to come over and help you clean. Is there anything you don't want me to touch before we start? The
Right.
power of question.
Mm, that's great. That's great advice.
Yeah, because you're also offering support as well, which is huge.
Exactly.
And just this is more
Mm.
curiosity from your experience, but have you noticed like the differences between how males versus females handle grief?
Yeah. So I also have a podcast, and season one of my podcast, I had a co host who was a widower. And our goal that season was to kind of uncover the gender disparities in the spouse loss realm. But what that really opened me up to was a larger cornucopia into the way that the man's mind works. It was quite the research project that I came out on the other side, like, oh, that's interesting. Where men typically, and again, this is all speaking in generalities, remembering, like, I didn't write the book, I'm just reading the paper, right? So men typically, after a loss, will get into a committed long-term relationship within 3 months of the loss. Why? Because they are filling that caregiver role. It's men who've been married for 10 years or longer. They lose their spouse and they immediately jump into a relationship. She's statistically 10 years or more younger than the wife. And she is someone who is either a stay-at-home mom with small children, a solopreneur, or like a venture capitalist type thing. She works from home or has flexible schedule. It harkens to the man needing to feel loved, secure, taken care of, nurtured, especially if there are children in the situation, right? If he has children, it's someone who's going to help fill that maternal role. Completely subconscious. Let me put that out there. Men are not doing this, like, some men are doing this viciously, but in general, 99%, it is subconscious because they're feeling a void. They also don't typically talk about their feelings, and they're 57% more likely to experience bouts of rage, get into motor vehicle accidents, and become an alcoholic. Men suppress their feelings. So, what does that
Yes,
tell
they
you about how
do.
they are at the workplace?
Oh, I can only
Think
imagine.
about when you have that loss, right? And then you go to your typical workplace. If you are repressed and you're inward and you're angry and you're bitter and you're defensive and you're resentful, how does that bode well with your coworkers? And then you don't talk about it because you don't air your dirty laundry. You don't talk about your shit. You don't talk about your feelings, right? That's none of their business. You're cool. It's fine. Just going to go slam a Red Bull and get on with your day, right?
Mm,
Like, that's about the average consensus for men. Where women actually, and this is the part that was wild to me, are more, I think it was like 37% more likely to develop an STD due to increased promiscuity and sexually explicit behavior after a spouse loss.
Wow.
So women like go on a wid-ho phase. That's what it's known as, wid-ho. Yeah. Widow's fire is also what it's known as, is that need for so if you think about it, women process emotions and connection through like physical contact and that loving, nurturing connection that way. So it makes sense that a woman needing to feel secure, safe, strong, taken care of, and all of her world feeling secure, she pursues that in a true show of testosterone. Right? Like, nothing
mhm,
on a brain chemical level is more pure man testosterone than male arousal,
mhm.
plain and simple. So men go for the nurturing role fill and women go for the physical connection. That seems to be
Yeah.
the
Interesting.
standard.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
And
that
they
is
don't date each
interesting.
other generally. Like, it is not among the widow or separated population. They
Right.
would rather date a divorcee than they would a fellow widow or widower.
Wow, that's
Huh.
fascinating.
And you
That
would
is
think that they would
fascinating.
want that because there's that, like, you speak the same
Connection.
language.
Yeah.
Right.
Right,
But there's
exactly.
almost, because of the difference in timelines, it's that lack of readiness or filling shoes or having to let go of grief before it's processed and negotiating shared spaces. And yeah, I wrote a whole blog post about dating after death. It was fascinating.
Wow.
And now, do you? And yeah, this
The
is
things
really
you didn't know you were
fascinating.
going to learn on this
I
episode.
know. What's what I'm saying. I'm like, you know what? Forget the rest of these questions here. I want to know more about what's going on here, right?
Yeah.
So, in your experiences, then, when you're talking to individuals, because I'm sure you have conversations outside of just, employees, employers, right, and small
Yeah.
businesses. People, you have those more maybe personal conversations, or people who come to you knowing your experiences. Now, is guilt a big topic when that
Mm.
happens, right? Like, and then because we know the role guilt plays on how people, behave and act and the way they think and their decision making and all that. So, how much of a factor is guilt when those things maybe are happening to them and they're unsure why? I guess, like,
Mm.
for a lack of a better term.
Guilt is such a funny emotion, right? Like, because it's not what I like to call a core emotion. It's not like something rooted in sadness, anger, fear. Those are your core emotions.
Yeah.
Everything else is a subset of sadness, anger, or fear, or happiness. And so guilt stems from the potential of a couple different scenarios, right? Like, there's the guilt that, say the person had cancer and you were wishing them, like, oh God, I wish they weren't suffering. And then they, like, unexpectedly died quickly. And you're like, oh my God, that's my fault. I did that. I feel
Right.
guilty.
Right.
Or feeling guilt that you're relieved that they've passed because you know they're not suffering. Like, oh my God, that's really sick. I shouldn't be thinking like that. There's guilt in that. And that, I can say, it's not your weight to carry.
Hmm.
You can honor it, you can observe it, you can feel it, but water moves through rock by allowing it to flow. You have to
Mhm.
make peace with it and know that that's not yours. For the people who feel guilt in not those situations, right? Like, I know Craig and I had a couple of arguments and we had a fight the day before he died. And he had been in the hospital for a long period of time, a couple of weeks, and we just had been physically disconnected several weeks where we had no physical contact just due to everything. And so I got to a point where I was feeling really, like, disconnected from him. I started to cry and blah, blah, blah. And he snapped at me and he was like, every time we talk on the phone, it can't be about how much you miss me. And then, like, we kind of had this little spat.
Mhm.
And I felt really guilty afterwards because I was like, oh, that's not fair to him. Like, he's in hospital, blah, blah, blah. And then he died the next day, right? And that emotion, like, was amplified, where I was like, oh my God, the last real phone conversation I had with my husband is me blubbering at him and him snapping at me. Now, we had a
Mm.
text conversation the morning before he passed and we had resolved things. But the last time I talked to him on the phone, we had a disagreement.
Mm.
Like, there's such immense weight and guilt there. But I also know to my core, so much so that it was engraved in our wedding bands, everything happens for a reason. And there's a lot of mixed reviews on that sentence, right? Like,
Mhm.
everything happens for a reason. But so much of my life has come back to that sentence ringing true that I can't deny it. And I know that I can't hold that guilt. And so for the people out there experiencing it, just know it's normal, right? The weight of that is normal, but it's not yours to carry.
Mm.
That's huge. I think a lot of times too, because you talked about before about people don't use like the time off that they have, especially like when it
Mm,
comes to bereavement, but there's like
mm.
that guilt factor of I really shouldn't take this time off and stuff.
Oh God, I got to
It's-
get back to work. Everyone's waiting for me.
yeah,
Right.
There's a big
yeah,
project.
Exactly.
And, like,
Exactly. Yep.
if you
yeah.
don't take the time now, grief is just going to sack you
Mhm.
later.
When you least expect
And
it, yeah.
when
Right.
it's probably less convenient, right? Like,
Yeah.
much like a home equity loan. If you need the loan, you probably can't get the loan.
Yeah.
So this is like a loan. You are
Right. Right.
processing the emotions now on that loaned time, because when you need the loan, you're not going to
Yep.
have the bandwidth to do it.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
So
And
take the time and rest your physical body.
in
Let
many
those
organizations,
cortisol hormones level out.
Mm.
Let that fluid in your joints reabsorb. Let your cardiac rhythm come back to a baseline. Like, take the time. Be with family. Go hug your dog. Go for a walk. Go on a fishing trip. Whatever it is but take the time. I beg you, take the time.
And with that, so many organizations, impose a timeline for grieving, right? Before employees can come back to work. What have you helped to kind of educate the employer as far as like the imposed time frame on that? And like, are you navigating education on the employer side, but you're also trying to provide that communication to the individual as well? Because again, it's like, hey, you got to get paid to come back at the same time, so hurry up. It's almost like, to me, again, because I'm in corporate America as well, and it's like bereavement has always had this, hey, this is the only amount of time you get to grieve. When you come back, you're fine. And I feel like
check your shit at the door.
Yeah.
Right.
And
But
I want you to
here
come
I am
back
to challenge the status quo, right?
Yep.
And I'm fortunate in the perspective that my business was born post-COVID. And I say that because the way that we operate from a business perspective post-COVID is so different than how we operated before, right? Now employees are acting their wage and micro-retiring and quiet quitting. Why? Because they do not have to tolerate being treated by employers like it is a one-way thing. At-will employment means both sides. You are just as at will with them as they are with you. So for the employers who want to be progressive, who want to continue to succeed in a post-pandemic economy, have to change their strategies for retaining employees, developing employees, enticing new employees. And that comes down to what makes you different. Your benefit offerings, your benefit packages. Employees are looking for companies that invest in them, in their overall health and well-being. Right? Like we're seeing a global shift. You guys know we're seeing a global shift in how companies approach health and wellness programs for employees. There's more of an investment, both in time, in money, in education, so much so that even some health programs are getting continuing ed credits for employers. So they get paid for their professional development day to go to their nutritionist appointment once a month for some employers, right? Like we see the intrinsic business value. And now it's taking that same approach and applying it to bereavement. How do we understand that? The neuroscience is out there. The brain chemicals do not lie. Grief is a 6-month process on average. That first 6 to 7 weeks is when your brain is dumped with cortisol. So yeah, you can work and it's kind of up to you, but you're going to hit a peak where you're going to need time. And we can't really pay for that, right? We can't really account for that. Like, can't give everybody undetermined amount of time for whenever they need it, however, like it's very ambiguous. So we have to put some parameters in place. So I model a lot of what I ask for, what I teach for, what I help companies develop. I model a lot of it after maternity leave, right? So in the state of Connecticut, we maternity leave are entitled to 16 weeks of paid compensation of up to 50% of our weekly salary. They just recently passed paternity leave. So I think that's 8 weeks at 40% compensation. Both of those are entitled to bonding time, additional 4 weeks that do not have to be used consecutively, and you have up to a year to use them. Both of those are allowed for the Paid Family Medical Leave Act here in Connecticut that just got passed. Bereavement leave, you are legally entitled to 3 days. 3 days. You can have FMLA job protection, but that is without compensation protection. You do not count for the Connecticut Paid Family Medical Leave Act because that is double dipping. It's a separate bucket for bereavement. Your next step after those 3 days is your vacation time. I could take my vacation time after my daughter was born, right? Like I took my 16 weeks maternity leave, I took my 4 weeks bonding time, and then I took my 2 weeks of PTO. No, I lied. I took 1 week before she was born. I went on maternity leave a week before she was born. So I went on maternity leave a week early, technically. But I took a week at the end, and that was my vacation. But look at all that time I got off, right? And I got paid for it. So eventually, I'm asking for legislative change where we will mirror paternity leave. I'm asking for 8 weeks at 40% compensation. Because we are given a 9-month runway to prepare for a life coming into this world. And if you take politics and religion and opinion out of it, at the end of the day, parenthood can be a choice. Death is inevitable.
Mhm.
And we need to do better to put an honorance and a reverence for the exit just as much as we do the entrance.
That's
Wow.
incredibly well said. Incredibly well
Thank
said.
you.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, and just on a very basic level, right? Hearing that, I'm thinking when you're saying it, the emotional toll of birth versus death, it's no contest. As a man, right? The physical toll, I don't understand, right? I'm a man. I don't understand what that does for a woman's body. Like I know what it does, but I can't
You
say I
know,
know
but
what it
it's
does.
different.
You know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
It's
Apples
different,
to
right? But
oranges,
like,
but they live in the same
exactly.
produce department.
But man, like the emotional toll, that's such a long lasting thing that to only get 3 days is just incomprehensible to understand.
And let's be clear, 3 days is for blood, quote, blood relative, the way
Yes,
it's all
yes,
written.
yes.
So that's parent, spouse, child. So here's where it gets really messed up, right? If you have an adopted or a stepchild, that person probably gets 1 day, not 3, because they're not blood relative. Your grandmother passes away. Now, even if she raised you, you get 1 day. Some
Hmm.
companies will give you 3 for that instance, depending on where you have to travel or what. Aunt Mildred, 1 day. If you were to call work and say, oh my God, there's been a death in the family, I can't come in today. Oh, they're going to be like, take all the time you need, whatever. You go in the next day and you say, yeah, that was really tragic. We had to put the dog down. Everyone's going to look at you like you had 3 heads because they're going to feel like you lied to them.
Mm.
But you can't tell me that Fido and you aren't closer than you and Aunt Mildred, who you see once a year at Thanksgiving and she kind of smells like cheese. Like, I'm just saying, we all have that relative, right? But you get more time off for that relative than you do the family dog who loves you unconditionally for the last 10 years.
Right, exactly.
The way that we process relations and death is so oddly tied to work stuff. And I
Mm.
never understood that. So that's another piece of the legislation I'd like to change is the verbiage that removes that blood family parameter, because that shouldn't be predetermined by a governing piece of paper. They shouldn't be able to tell me how important the relationship is, right?
Right.
If
Yeah.
you are a pregnant woman and you have a early term miscarriage, so after 10 weeks before 27 weeks, most instances they will force you to carry the baby to term and deliver said baby. You are not entitled to either maternity leave or bereavement leave in that situation in the state of Connecticut.
Jeez.
So what do you do?
Crazy.
Oh, good. You have 2 weeks of PTO that you can take,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then you can apply for short-term disability and go on short-term disability, but that's a black mark on your record. So now you're probably excluded from any job promotion, health insurance benefits, HSA accounts, and life insurance packages because you have a pre-existing condition now.
And yeah, that's just
The
it's
system
so
works to keep you broken because you don't know about it.
yeah, yeah. And the level of awareness that like just hearing you talk about it today and in our prior conversation is just it's I know I don't want to speak for you, BG. I didn't know 99% of this stuff, right? And it's just
No.
it's crazy to think and as
And
someone who's
people go through this
experienced
every
death,
day.
right?
On
Every day.
average, 1/4 of the US workforce is suffering from active grief. Active grief is defined as grief symptoms significant enough to interrupt your day-to-day being.
That's
One
just
quarter of the workforce, but they're still going to work because they don't have the time. They don't
yes.
have the resources. They don't have the support. Because
Yeah.
if they just had an employer who looked at them and said, you look like shit, go home,
Right.
and made them go home, or say, hey, I'm going to take half of your workload and I'm going to split it up amongst a couple other people for a couple of weeks. We'll try again and it's no harm, no foul.
Mm.
Hey, do you want to work from home this week? Like, I know this is the anniversary week.
Yeah.
Send flowers, sign the sympathy card, go to the funeral if you're local, like
Mhm.
little
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Just show support.
Right.
And the other piece of it too is like, when you bring up the 3 bereavement days, and that's for like a corporation or organization, some businesses don't have that. But even within those days, normally they're like planning. They're planning the funeral.
Yeah,
They're
because
planning
they're
the wake.
bereavement. And
Yeah.
Right.
bereavement is the legal financial process. But here's the thing, you don't even have the death certificate after 3 days.
No.
And you
Yeah.
can't do anything without the death certificate. You can't do life insurance. You can't buy the burial plot. You can't do the funeral. You can't do nothing.
Hmm.
And if there's an autopsy involved, delay that process by about 6 weeks.
Hmm.
If
Yeah.
probate is involved, like with me, the finances of it, delay that by 19 months, all said and done. But like there are layers that add complications to it, and nobody
Yeah.
talks about this stuff. So you really don't understand how involved it is.
Yeah.
And it's an employer's job to ensure that your employee has a workspace that's conducive to them doing their job. That obligation means you provide a workplace culture that's conducive to retention, that's conducive to positive mental health and physical well being, that's supportive of a work life balance, that's supportive of actual family values.
Yeah. And it's refreshing hearing someone speak about it. It really, and hearing someone who's obviously passionate and speaks about it well. And that will lead us here to our last question with you, which is something that Brian and I found so incredibly interesting when we originally talked. Was you did a TEDx talk back in
I sure did.
2024. And we would just love to know the experience of that TEDx. Because you speak so well, everyone who's listening can obviously tell that, and the way are very articulate in your words. But
Thank you.
tell us about that experience, and what that did for you, what that was like, how rewarding it was, and so on.
I'm so grateful for, shout out to Lee Simmons, who's a personal friend of mine now. He is the organizer. Him and his friend Laura, they have put it on for the last, I think this is their 9th year doing it. I think I was year 8. But it's all volunteer based, this program. And he's lucky enough where he owns an event planning and production company. So he has all his own like stage equipment and uplighting and all this other stuff. So it makes it feel real legit. But like he does a hell of a job sourcing, interviewing, putting together such an incredible program. So before I talk about my experience, like just huge kudos to him, because
Mm,
I wouldn't have had the experience I had if it weren't for what he provided. Similar to like I'm saying with workplaces, right? He provided such an environment where I could do what I did and what I felt and what I experienced. So I digress. It was a roller coaster, right? So it's about a year-long process. Applications open in February, so about this time last year. It's a 500-word short essay, and then if you get selected, you get a phone call and you do like an interview, and then you wait, and then you get selected again, and then you do another interview, and then you get selected, right? And that's so I went from over 500 applicants to one of 25 to one of 8. So that was
Wow.
really cool, right? And they came
mm,
from all across the country. There was someone from Arizona this year. I know there was applicants from a couple people in Canada, a couple people in Mexico. So it wasn't just like just
mhm.
Connecticut, right? Which made it even cooler. That made me feel really special.
Yeah, yeah.
But so then they pair you with a TED Talk coach. Mine was phenomenal. Jeremy Brewer, he was incredible. He's also done TED on the big stage, and he's done TEDx. And they kind of help you understand the TED process, right? So for you guys have watched TED Talks before, you
Mhm.
know that the purpose of TED stands for technology, engineering, and design. It's to educate you. It's an educational moment where you should walk away with an aha and an action where you should go, that makes me want to do something differently. And so to write for TED, write in that style took a little bit of challenging. So Jeremy was really good at like helping me get behind the TED style. Um, I went through, I don't know, probably 14 drafts of what I was going to do just to burn it to the ground, excuse me, and rewrite it completely 2 weeks before show day. They were not happy with me for doing that because we had like signed, sealed, committed, this is our talk. And then it was like rehearsal, the
Right.
first rehearsal 2 weeks before show. And I roll up with a completely different jaws on the floor. They were like, that's not what we talked about. Like, we got through it. A little bit of some growing pains there, but we got through it. That that experience was the first time that I regaled people on a public platform my loss story.
Mm,
I had told what had happened kind of in an abridged version on a Facebook Live video on the 1-year anniversary of Craig's passing. But I had written a blog about it, right? But it's different to talk about it. And
Mm.
so to stand on a stage with 368 people in a room and over 1,500 people on live stream and stand on that platform and tell my loss story in
Yeah.
graphic detail, right? Like that took a lot of practice. And so TED Talk happened on December 1st. So the whole month of November, which is my loss month, I am just practicing my loss story on repeat. Just raw dog and the trauma for myself the month
Right,
of November
right.
last year. It was not pretty. Damn near had a breakdown about it. So when we talk about grief is real and it persists, like I was locked in my bedroom for a solid 4 days at one point because I just couldn't even
Mm.
word. Like I couldn't people, I couldn't word. There was nothing. The battery was empty. But once I like came out of the grief burrito and I realized that I had to put one foot in front of the other because people needed to hear this, I got back up and I got practicing. And the day of, you kind of dissociate, you stand on the stage. I could probably tell you legitimately what happened the first 3 minutes and what happened the last 2 minutes, but everything else I know because I watched it. Like I
Mhm.
wasn't there.
Right, right.
But it's wild what that does to how people listen to you. Because I'm not saying anything different than what I've been saying for the last 2.5 years. But I'm saying it with a little bit more weight behind me now, right? Like to say that I gave a TED talk where I use research data that talks about the CDC doing a study where they found that $225 billion are lost every year due to mismanaged leave. $225 billion are lost because businesses don't manage time off well. So what if we could take just a little sliver of that money
Mm.
and spend it on all of the programs that all of these businesses say they can't afford, on all of this time off that people say they can't risk losing the employee for, on the benefit packages, on the health insurance, on the life insurance policies for your employees. Just a sliver, right? Like,
Yeah.
and countries, the other thing that TED Talk gave me was like a global perspective because they ask you to write in such a way where you can then take your idea and expand it to a larger world. And so what that did,
Wow.
it afforded me the opportunity to do some really deep research. So like France, Portugal, Spain, Canada, Uruguay, Uganda, there's a bunch of other countries that all recently within the last 17 months have updated their bereavement leave policies to be that of almost 3 weeks.
Wow.
So it's like we're seeing the global shift in
Mm.
understanding how employers and employees relate and how we understand what bereavement is and how it's different than grief and how we embrace grief. Think about like what's out there for mainstream media shows. So you've got like Dead Like Me, you've got what's the one Ricky Gervais did. There's like so many TV programs of recent are
Mm.
about widowhood, death, drug overdose, loss, grief. There's like so many things. It's becoming mainstream. The last piece of that puzzle is employers. The media
Sure.
accepts it.
Yeah.
Now we just need our employers to embrace it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. It's
Yeah.
it's wild. It's wild.
Hey man, I encourage anybody out there who thinks they have a great idea, right? Like just apply to do the TED Talk because even if you don't get selected to do it, right? There's no limit to the number of times you can apply.
Mhm.
TEDx happens everywhere. I think there's over 180 different TEDx locations. It's happening around the country. Even if you don't get selected, you get the process of like putting that idea to paper. And there's
Right.
something validating about that, right? Like your
Mm.
ideas
Yeah.
matter. And if you put those ideas on paper, it's one step towards making the world a better place.
I love that. I love that.
That's great.
Okay, this has been an incredible conversation. What you're
So
doing,
good.
helping the employers, helping individuals navigate grief, it's truly inspiring. Where
Mm.
can individuals and employers reach you?
Yeah, so primarily I'm on LinkedIn if people want to check out my platform there and kind of see all the things I'm up to. They also can go right to my website. So on Tuesdays we wear black, just abbreviated otwwb.com. And that way they can read about how my business got its name and learn the story and read my lost story. Trigger warning there. They can, watch my TED Talk, hear my podcast, and stay tuned for all of the events I have coming up. One of those is September 20th will be my second annual Grief Education and Awareness Conference. So the Mark Twain House has graciously offered to host us.
Awesome.
So we'll be doing that, where we're doing an all-day professional development conference to help educate and embrace grief in the workplace.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well,
Amazing.
Kate, thank you so much for coming on Model Mindset. We learned a lot, and I know our audience does as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys.